Good morning for another edition of Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com, and now we'll continue our reading and discussion of the book, The Global Vatican. Who's at the head of this new global government that is taking control of the United States and the rest of the world? The answer is in the title, The Global Vatican. Yesterday, we concluded with discussion about the height of the French Revolution. France had literally closed the Catholic churches, reduced the priests to mere citizens, and told the Pope he was no Pope, basically. And now we'll continue where we left off yesterday. The last paragraph on page 29 of the book, if you're following along, it says, the terror soon sputtered out in France, but the worst was yet to come for the Pope. The final insult was delivered by the little general from Corsica, Napoleon Bonaparte, just launching a military career that would soon make him the dictator of France and the conqueror of Europe. In 1796, Bonaparte invaded Milan, from which he announced his intention to advance south and take Rome. In exchange for not invading, he demanded a huge ransom from the Pope, including cash and hundreds of rare manuscripts and paintings from the Vatican's collection. Of course, this was not the first time the Vatican had been plundered. Charles V had done much the same as Napoleon back in 1527. But for sheer hubris and greed, Napoleon had few equals. In February of 1798, critical year for the papacy. While Napoleon was away preparing his invasion of Egypt, the French army entered Rome and declared a new Roman Republic, this one without a pope. Pius VI, now 80 years old and critically ill, was put into a carriage to be exiled from the city forever. When the Pope begged to die in Rome, the French commander only scoffed, quote, "A man can die anywhere," unquote. Anywhere turned out to be a military citadel in Valence, France, where Pope Pius VI, after being hauled roughly across the Alps, spent the last days in captivity. When he passed away in August of 1799, the French refused to give him a Catholic burial. The greatest of insults. Some prognosticators saw the end of the papacy in the undignified death of Pope Pius VI, that he might be the last pope to ever serve. This turned out not to be the case. Understandably, though, it would be a very long time before anyone inside the Vatican was able to look at what France had done to the Catholic religion and not suspect that the real meaning of the phrase liberty, equality, and fraternity was atheism, chaos, and brutality. This is the mortal wound. I believe the Bible speaks of the mortal wound inflicted upon the beast. And this is when the papacy, who had kept God's people in captivity, would go into captivity. This is when he who ruled by the sword was destroyed by the sword. Pope Pius VI, supposedly the end of the papacy. And history reveals to us, in comparison with current events, the papacy has returned to its original global strength. And it could not have happened were there still Protestantism in the world. Think of it. What became of Protestantism? Futurism. That's what became of Protestantism. The abandonment of the biblical, historical, and prophetic truth. The very basis of Protestantism is that the papacy is, was, and always will be the little horn, the man of sin, the son of perdition, the Antichrist of the Bible. And now the whole Protestant world, having left its Protestant foundations, believe in a future Antichrist, one who has never set foot upon the earth as of yet, and one which won't appear on the world scene until 7 or 3.5 years or so before Christ's literal return. And so he doesn't need to be discussed. No one needs to know about the Antichrist, because in futurism, this Jesuit brew called futurism says that, well, the church will be raptured out. Little icing on the cake to make the Jesuit cake even more sweet. It's all a lie. It's all a lie. And it's time for God's people, especially in Jesuit-run America, to return to its Protestant roots. Now we'll continue with chapter 3 in the book. It's entitled Return to Rome. Here's a quote by Napoleon Bonaparte. Does he imagine that his excommunication will make the weapons fall from the hands of my soldiers? That's what Napoleon Bonaparte thought of Pope Pius VI's excommunications. The 18th century, to paraphrase Charles Dickens, had been the best of times and the worst of times. The era inspired great leaps of human thought and aspiration, but also disrupted a system of spiritual faith and moral values that sustained people for millennia. It gave life to a revolution in America that resulted in the first true democratic republic in the world. But it also spawned a revolution in France that that wreaked violence and injustice throughout Europe. Across its stage strode a great general, George Washington, who led America to victory over the British, then served the nation as the first democratically elected president. But it also marked the debut of another remarkable general, Napoleon Bonaparte, who tried and failed to conquer the world. It's one of those interesting quirks of history that the last month of the last year of the century, December of 1799, saw the convergence of several milestones, almost as if the century intended to go out with a bang. On December 12th, Napoleon Bonaparte, just 30 years old, assumed the title of First Consul and became virtual dictator of France. 2 days later, on December 14th, George Washington, at 67, passed away at Mount Vernon and sent the United States into mourning. Meanwhile, at a Benedictine monastery on an island near Venice, the conclave of Roman Catholic cardinals met to elect a new pope. The outcome of their deliberations would not be certain for several more months, but one thing was already clear. The last pope, Pope Pius VI, would not be the last pope after all. Many striking changes accompanied the turn from the 18th century into the 19th century as the age of revolution lurched into the age of Napoleon. But perhaps the most surprising was the shift in the fortunes of the papacy. Popes were hardly in for smooth sailing in years to come, quite the contrary. But the dawn of the new century brought a resurgence in the power and moral authority of the Church, that is the Roman Catholic Church, that nobody would have predicted a decade earlier. The modern Holy See was born in the dying days of the French Revolution. One of Napoleon's first official acts in those final days of 1799 was to order funeral honors for Pope Pius VI. Remember, he denied him a Catholic burial originally, the greatest of insults. Now Napoleon is ordering full funeral mass for Pope Pius VI, who still lay unburied in a sealed coffin in Valence. Having dragged the Pope to his death, or at least made the final earthly journey as unpleasant as possible, the French, under Napoleon, now seem to have a change of heart. Another indication of Napoleon's new attitude toward the church came 6 months later in June of 1800. By this time, the new pope, a former Benedictine monk who took the name Pope Pius VII, had been crowned and had taken up residence in Rome. 300 miles to the northwest, in a cathedral in Milan, Napoleon delivered a speech to local clergy. Quote, "I wish to see you all gathered here that I might have the satisfaction of disclosing in my own person the feelings which I entertain for the Catholic Apostolic Roman religion. I am convinced that this religion is the only one that can bring true happiness to a well-ordered community and lay firm the foundations of government. I assure you that I shall strive to guard and defend it at all times, and by all means." Unquote. Quite a change of heart, isn't it? Now, Napoleon had... Now, just let me reflect a bit. Napoleon Bonaparte was a Freemason, 33rd degree. He tended to conquer the Roman Catholic Church in France and liberate France and punish the Roman Catholic Church, punish the papacy, punish the priests of France. And now all of a sudden, he says Roman Catholicism is the only hope for true happiness in a well-ordered community. Who is he working for? The Jesuits. The Jesuits, that's who he's working for. What we're witnessing is the Jesuit punishment of the Roman Catholic Church and the papacy, and the demonstration that at any time they will, they can organize through a Freemason such as Napoleon Bonaparte a complete overthrow of the church. They demonstrated it by their actions. They punished all of the papal monarchs, all the leaders of the nations of Europe. Punished them for what? Why, the suppression of the Jesuits, of course. The Jesuits and their concordant orders, the Freemasons, literally spanked the papacy into non-existence and then recreated it in their own image. And this is exactly why we have a Jesuit pope today. The papacy literally surrendered to the Jesuits' Freemasonic Napoleon Bonaparte. And once the victory had been won by the Jesuits, once the punishment had been thoroughly inflicted, so much so that it appeared the papacy was a thing of the past, Napoleon has this unexplainable change of heart. And that simply means that the Jesuits and the papacy have gotten together and come to an understanding. We're going to have this papal New World Order, but it's the Jesuits who are going to control it. So, and this is why many historians today now refer to the papacy as the Jesuit papacy. The Jesuits actually performed a hostile takeover of the papal chair. That's the answer. This makes perfect sense now. The real target of the French Revolution was the Jesuit overthrow of the papal chair. Now, Napoleon had maligned Catholicism in the past, but apparently no longer. Quote, France has had her eyes opened through suffering and has seen that the Catholic religion is her single anchor amid the storm. Unquote. Napoleon's sentiments echoed a theme George Washington raised in his farewell address in 1796. Quote, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. Unquote. Washington further wrote, quote, the mere politician, equally with the pious man, ought to respect and to cherish them. Unquote. In the case of France, the people, not the politicians, first grasped how indispensable religion was to a country that had been Roman Catholic since the days of Clovis. However, his own spiritual beliefs, whatever his own spiritual beliefs and his most constant object of worship seemed to be himself, Napoleon recognized that Catholic piety was already reawakening across France, and that most of his countrymen were eager to return to the old faith. Facing a populace weary of years of revolution and chaos, Napoleon realized he needed the church. Okay? Napoleon, a representative of the Jesuits and a representative of the state, needed the church. It's an unholy alliance that has existed throughout history. The alliance between church and state, now controlled by the Jesuits. He says, my political method, Napoleon once said on the subject of religion, is to govern men as a majority of them want to be governed, unquote. Napoleon not only wanted to restore the Catholic faith, he wanted the new pope to help him restore it. The French clergy who survived the revolution were bitterly divided between those who had signed the Constitution and those who had refused. The only person who could reconcile these two groups, Napoleon understood, was the Pope. Quote, go to Rome, he told an emissary, and tell the Holy Father that the First Consul wishes to make him a gift of 30 million Frenchmen, unquote. In other words, Holy Father, I give you my country. Quite a turn of events, is it not? Realizing that Napoleon, a man of extraordinary political acumen on one hand and intolerance of rivals on the other, was willing to deal with the Pope, says a great deal about his estimation of the importance of Catholicism. Quote, there has seldom been a more convincing tribute to the underlying strength of the Church, wrote E.E.Y. Hales in his highly regarded History of Catholicism. Over the next months, representatives of Napoleon and Pius VII worked on a concordat, setting the terms of Catholicism's restoration in France. The concordat had to overcome the objections of both French Jacobins, who could not bear the return of Catholicism to France, and conservative cardinals who could not abide making peace with a government that deeply harmed the Church. Napoleon pressured the Pope's Secretary of State, Ercles Consalvi, to accept his conditions by threatening to break off from the Roman Catholic Church completely. Quote, if Henry VIII, who had not a 20th part of my power, could successfully change the religion of his country, surely I can do the same, unquote. After a meeting lasting 20 consecutive hours, the two sides managed to draft an agreement, only to have Napoleon throw it into the fire in a fit of pique. Finally, an understanding was reached. The concordat was signed on July 15, 1801. No sooner was this accomplished, however, than Napoleon had second thoughts. He began unilaterally to amend the the concordat, attaching 77 quote-unquote organic articles to the original document, most of which severely abridged or limited the Pope's authority and left no doubt who controlled the church in France. Pius VII was an exceptionally thoughtful, good-hearted, and open-minded man, says the author. He read the works of John Locke and Diderot's Encyclopedia when most of his fellow clergy did not dare to wade into the perilous waters of the Enlightenment. He shocked some of his more reactionary colleagues in 1797 when, as Bishop of Bologna, he announced that democratic forms of government were not necessarily incompatible with the Catholic religion. The first and last time for a very long while that any church official, much less a future pope, would suggest as much. As a matter of fact, I will just simply add, Pope Pius IX wrote the encyclical and syllabus of error damning all democratic forms of worship, of government. And with the same document, condemned all the tenets of Protestantism. So, but never forget that democracy, democratic forms of government, were the brainchild of the Jesuits, of Bellarmine and Suarez and the like. Now, he was a man, in other words, who believed in reasoned compromise. Of course, the Pope, when he is forced to compromise in order to save his throne, he'll compromise, but only to return to the status quo as soon as his power enables him. He says this was a belief Napoleon would severely test. For the moment, Pius reluctantly accepted the First Consul's conditions. He made a tactical decision, notice the word tactical. He made a tactical decision that restoring the church to France was more important than asserting his authority over it. Kind of like the position he took with the Roman Catholic Church in America, isn't it? Expedience guides the church. Okay? Expedience guides the papacy. The Pope has to tread lightly here in France at this time, just like he had to tread very, very lightly in the colonies. Is it the characteristic of the God of gods, the vicar of Christ, to have to tread lightly among men? Another distinction between Christ and Antichrist. All right, he says, moreover, the French, perhaps unwittingly, actually granted important new authority to the Pope. In resolving the issue of the divided French clergy, the concordat called for the Pope to dismiss all bishops and start with a clean slate. The First Consul would choose the new episcopate, but the appointments would not be valid until approved, that is, invested by the Pope, who would also have the right to depose them. In other words, the concordat affirmed the principle, never before conceded by the French government, that the Pope was the ultimate authority over ecclesiastical appointments. So the shadow government in France would be under the Pope's control. The hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church would be under the Pope's control and not Napoleon's. Okay? He says this would have the important long-term consequence of centralizing once again church authority in the person of the Pope. The publication of the Concordat was celebrated in Notre Dame on Easter Sunday, 1802. Napoleon and his retinue poured into the cathedral for Mass, and the bells of Notre Dame rang over Paris for the first time in a decade. Church and state united in France. What will happen in that case in America? We'll be back right after this.
I pledge allegiance to the King of Kings, and to his kingdom come, on earth as it is in heaven. One holy nation, under Heavenly Father, grace, mercy, justice for all.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Your area has just unexpectedly flooded. The power's out, so is the water, and you are thirsty. But wait, outside, look, there's lots of water. And then you see it.
Oh my gosh! What is that floating in the water? And what is that odor?
No problem. You thought ahead and own a Berkey water purification system. Berkey has revolutionized the way water is purified simply and naturally. Requiring no power, electricity, or water pressure, the powerful black Berkey elements extract pathogenic bacteria, cysts, parasites, chemicals, heavy metals, and other nasties that might be found in floodwater. Berkey systems can purify treated water during normal times, and during unexpected emergencies, they can get rid of the unhealthy stuff in raw, untreated water.
For more information on the powerful Berkey line of products, call First Amendment Radio at 559-781-3773 or order on the web at FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
All right, welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. If you'd like to hear the program continue, please support First Amendment Radio, who sponsors the program. And if you'd wish to contact me, you may do so by email. My email address is tom@seawaves.us. tom@seawaves.us. Okay, a brief recap. The Jesuits are suppressed by a papal bull. The Jesuits want vengeance. So they order a Freemasonically led revolution. A European revolution led by the Jesuits and their assistants, Napoleon Bonaparte of Freemasonry, and they punish the monarchs, the papal monarchs of Europe. They punish the papacy, leading the Pope into captivity, where he eventually died. If the papacy is going to continue, the papacy has to make some critical concessions to the Jesuits. The papacy secretly makes those concessions to the Jesuits, realizing that the papacy is toast unless they accept Jesuit leadership. The conquest of the world for the Pope will not be possible without the Jesuits' help. And having proved that by literally destroying the papacy had to concede. Now, once that concession was made, Napoleon has a change of heart and wants to restore the power of the Roman Catholic Church to France. But it's a Roman Catholic Church led by the Jesuits. And the papacy is Jesuit controlled. So now it's time to unite church and state once again under Jesuit control. All right. Pope Pius VII himself entered Notre Dame several years later on December 2nd, 1804. Accompanied by 6 cardinals, 10 bishops, and 100 horses, I wonder why they counted the horses, the Pope traveled to Paris to preside over the coronation or the crowning of Napoleon. The Pope's going to crown Napoleon now. See, this is a very, very intimate relationship. Not content with the title of First Consul, Napoleon had decided to make himself emperor, a more fitting position for a man who intended to rule the world. To give the new title its full legitimacy, he summoned the Pope to administer his crowning, as Pope Leo III had done for Charlemagne 1,000 years earlier. Pius VII, despite his misgivings about Napoleon, agreed to attend, perhaps sensing that he, like Leo, would gain something in the bargain. Making the same calculation that led him to accept Napoleon's altered concordat, the Pope targeted a long-term opportunity for the Holy See's diplomatic engagement with France, even if it risked a short-term perception of weakness. Napoleon made sure to put the Pope in his place at Notre Dame. He arrived an hour late. You imagine being an hour late for your own coronation. This is what you call being stylishly late. Being late sends a message. Pope, you're not as important as I am. Don't miss the point. It's still a power struggle. The Jesuit-controlled Freemason, Napoleon, still ranks himself superior to the papacy. Okay, he's got to make sure he's got complete control of the papacy. And he's got to give the public perception that he still rules Europe. All right, he arrived an hour late, then set the crown upon his own head as the Pope watched. Okay, now what happened when the Pope crowned Charlemagne? Well, the inference is that if the Pope crowns the emperor, the Pope can uncrown the emperor. Well, Napoleon is making the point perfectly clear. You don't have the same authority, Mr. Pope, that you had over Charlemagne. Okay? This is a Jesuit-run organization now. And I represent the Jesuits. You don't. All right? But Pius VII had already won a moral victory over the emperor since arriving in Paris. Having learned upon his arrival in Paris that Napoleon and his wife Josephine were married in a civil ceremony, that is, by the justice of the peace, instead of the Roman Catholic Church, he issued an ultimatum. They would submit to the wedding rites of the Roman Catholic Church, or he would refuse to attend the coronation. Okay? A little power struggle here. First of all, let me explain. In Roman Catholic canon law, you're not legitimately married unless you are married by a priest in a Roman Catholic Church. Okay? Marriage under Roman Catholic canon law is a sacrament. It is the exclusive right of the Roman Catholic Church to marry. All legitimate marriages, according to Roman law, are Catholic marriages. The rest of us need a license. Okay? So, Protestant marriage is, according to Roman law, marital concubinage. Okay? You're living with a harlot, and your children are bastards because your marriage was not consecrated by a priest. Okay, marriage is the sole jurisdiction of the Roman Catholic Church and the priesthood. Napoleon gets married by the civil government, and Rome doesn't recognize that marriage. Now, if he's going to be a legitimate emperor under the Pope's authority, remember this is at issue, well, then he has to get remarried in the Roman Catholic Church by a Roman Catholic priest. So this is a power struggle. All right. The Pope issued an ultimatum. The Napoleons would submit to the wedding rites of the Roman Catholic Church, or the Pope would refuse to attend his coronation. Napoleon had conceded. He and Josephine had been privately married by a priest in the Tuileries the previous afternoon. So Napoleon capitulated on that count. Now it says, much like the crowning of Charlemagne, the coronation did as much to elevate the Pope as it did to legitimize the emperor. Pius VII's presence in Paris raised his profile and prestige. The French flocked to him, and Napoleon later came to regret it. Quote, nobody thought of the Pope when he was in Rome, he complained. My coronation and his appearance in Paris made him important, unquote. An unfortunate turn of events for Napoleon. It says, over the next 10 years, as he warred with much of Europe, the emperor seemed intent on making the Pope pay for the impertinence of upstaging him at his own coronation. A prime opportunity came in 1806. Napoleon demanded that Pope Pius VII show his fealty by supporting a blockade against France's enemies and closing papal ports to England and Russian shipping. Pope Pius VII refused. Supporting a blockade would contradict the neutrality of the papacy and would make him party to war that was not his to fight. Napoleon responded furiously and vengefully by moving his troops into Rome and seizing the papal states in central Italy. Quote, your holiness is the sovereign of Rome, he reminded the Pope, but I am its emperor. All my armies ought to be yours, unquote. Pius VII's patience was finally strained to the limit. He issued a general excommunication against enemies of the Holy See, including Napoleon, not by name, but by description. The Pope had to know that he would pay a price for this, and he did. French soldiers broke into the Quirinal Palace in the early hours of July 6, 1809, abducted the Pope and his secretary, and whisked them away before dawn. Now, like Pius VI before him, Pius VII became a prisoner of the French. He was placed under house arrest in a palace on the Italian coast. So the Jesuits still warring with the papacy, trying to get their ducks in a row. Now the Pope bore his captivity stoically. He prayed constantly, read, washed and mended his own clothing, cut his own hair, and spent much of his time in solitude, much like the young Benedictine he had once been. Cut off from Rome, he had little power, but he did ably deploy the one bit of leverage that remained to him. He refused to approve any of the bishops that Napoleon nominated for the French church. When Napoleon tried to invest the bishops himself, the nominees refused to serve. For all the discord among the clergy within the French church after the Revolution, on this at least they agreed. They were not bishops until they received blessing of the Pope. Napoleon ordered that Pope Pius VII be transferred to him at Fontainebleau. He intended to talk sense into the, quote, imbecile old man, unquote, as he had taken to calling the Pope, and put an end to his insubordination. At midnight on June 9, 1812, the Pope was removed from the palace on the coast of Italy that served as his prison. The operation was undertaken with great stealth the wheels of the Pope's carriage covered in cloth to muffle their sound in the night. Like his predecessor, Pope Pius VII was now subjected to a grueling journey over the Alps. He became gravely ill en route and came so close to death that he was given last sacraments by a fellow priest. Pius survived the journey, arrived in Fontainebleau in shattered health, and then proceeded to wait for Napoleon for 6 months while the emperor waged war in Russia. It's doubtful that Pius VII spent his time praying for the emperor's military victory, as Pope Leo III had done for Charlemagne 1,000 years earlier. That December, Napoleon suffered one of the worst military defeats in history, returning home to France with merely 10,000 of the 400,000 men he had took to Moscow. There were mutterings among French clergy that the emperor's defeat was the judgment of God. The loss in Russia taught Napoleon nothing about hubris or vanity. Returning to Fontainebleau on January 18, 1813, he attempted to bully Pope Pius VII into signing a new concordat, the terms of which were far less favorable to the Holy See than the Concordat of 1801. The Pope resisted, but his bargaining position was weak. A prisoner in France, suffering poor health, cut off from friends and confidants, and unaware that Napoleon's own position was crumbling, Pius succumbed and signed a draft agreement. One of the stipulations was to move the seat of the papacy from Rome to France. The agreement also required the Pope to surrender the Papal States, relinquishing the temporal sovereignty that the Holy See had exercised since the rule of Pepin the Short in the 8th century. Almost immediately after signing, Pius recovered his strength and wits and renounced the Concordat of Fontainebleau. Napoleon insisted it was binding, even in draft form. How this dispute was ultimately resolved is unclear, but soon it was swept away by larger currents of history. Napoleon's loss in Russia, followed by another defeat at Leipzig in October of 1813, had shattered his invincibility. His enemies were closing in, and he had no more will to fight the Pope. He tore up the Concordat in January of 1814 and sent the Pope back to Italy. Pius's captivity was over. By the time Pius VII returned to Rome in May 24th of 1814, Napoleon was out of power, soon to be exiled to Elba. All of Rome greeted the long-lost Pope when he arrived at the city gates. Children waved palm fronds along the way as 30 young men from Rome's noble families pulled Pius's unhitched carriage through the city to St. Peter's, where Pius VII, after 6 years' absence, resumed his throne. The Pope would have to flee once more when Napoleon escaped from Elba and reemerged as the Emperor of France in the spring of 1815. But this coda, the 100 days, as it's known, was short-lived, and soon the Pope was back in Rome in the Quirinal Palace. As Europe's rulers met in Vienna to redraw Europe in the aftermath of Napoleon, Pope Pius VII focused on rebuilding a Catholic Church badly damaged by a quarter century of continuous revolution and war. Despite illness and frailty, the Pope showed great moral fortitude, says this author, standing up to Napoleon as other monarchs fell by the wayside. The papacy survived. Remember, this history is being recounted by this author to justify the belief that the papacy is the vicar of Christ and shall never see sorrow. Now, one of Pius VII's first acts to restore the church after the revolution, and Napoleon was as symbolically potent as it was practical, he lifted the ban on the Society of Jesus. See what's happened? The deal has been struck. There may be just some lingering controversy yet between the Jesuitically controlled Freemasonic Emperor Napoleon and the Jesuitically controlled papacy, but they're ironing out their problems, and so much so that this pope is going to defy a previous pope's papal bull, papal thunder, suppressing the Jesuits, and reinstate them. So much for infallibility, right? John Carroll's reaction, remember we're back in the colonies now, John Carroll's reaction to the reinstatement of the Jesuits is undocumented, but it must have been emotional. Now remember, while all these shenanigans are going on in Europe, reestablishing the Jesuits as the rulers of the papacy and the rulers of Europe, the Jesuits, through John Carroll and other Jesuit priests in the country, one of whose name was White, and I assert, most controversially, that the White House is actually named after him. You won't hear that anywhere else. But while the Jesuits are busy spanking Europe for the suppression of the Jesuits are creating a continental enclave in America. The first beast was dying just as the second beast was being born. And it was through America that the Jesuits planned to conquer the rest of the world for the Jesuit general, for the papacy. John Carroll's reaction to the reinstatement of the Jesuits is undocumented, but it must have been emotional. These were exuberant days for Catholics, and they must have been especially gratifying for Bishop Carroll, who turned 80 in the start of 1815, and finally, the final year of his life. Carroll and his countrymen were far removed from the Napoleonic Wars, but they were not unaffected. The War of 1812, indirectly prompted by England's blockade against Napoleon's France, a response to Napoleon's own blockade against England, was one notable sideshow of the European drama. Carroll himself witnessed the British bombing of Baltimore in the late summer of 1814. Carroll also had one odd but not insignificant brush with the Bonaparte family during Napoleon's reign. This came in 1803 when the bishop presided over the wedding of a 17-year-old Maryland belle, Elizabeth Patterson, to her 22-year-old sweetheart, a French naval captain named Jerome Bonaparte, Napoleon's youngest brother. John Carroll had hardly been blamed for the wedding held in Baltimore Cathedral on Christmas Eve 1803, but it later became a matter of contention between Napoleon and Pope Pius VII. Disgusted by his brother's youthful folly, Napoleon demanded that the Pope annul the marriage. Pius refused, Pius's refusal added to the score the emperor later tried to settle by imprisoning him. When not attending to weddings and other pastoral duties, John Carroll spent his time overseeing the expanding American, and I'll add the words, Roman Catholic Church, which now included, in addition to Baltimore, dioceses in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Louisville, Kentucky, where a number of Maryland Catholics migrated, and his view of the American, and I'll add again the words, the American Roman Catholic Church had evolved. Immediately after the American Revolution, Carroll favored a distinctly indigenous church, unencumbered by Rome's interference. Remember, that also was an imperative the American Roman Catholic Church had to at least appear to be aloof from the papacy, the man of sin, the son of perdition, the Antichrist of the Bible, or the Protestants would make them pay. You see, the Catholics in the country were still treading lightly so as not to provoke a Protestant return to anti-Catholicism. Remember, they had just fought a Revolutionary War together. So there was the nucleus for camaraderie, if nothing else. Patriotism was something that they both shared. But the Catholics of the country had to tread lightly. They had to distance themselves from the papacy. All right. Immediately after the American Revolution, Carroll favored a distinctly indigenous church, unencumbered by Rome's interference. Later, as a bishop, he steered the church in a more conservative and recognizably Roman direction. He remained a strong advocate of the separation of church and state and of religious pluralism, both inherent in American values, but sought to organize and centralize the American hierarchy and, increasingly, to echo the European model of Catholicism. Critical phrase that, it says, and to centralize the American hierarchy, that is, the American bishops, the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church, the hierarchy of the American Roman Catholic Church, the shadow government, and to increasingly echo the European model of Catholicism. The author has just, in his own language, told you that America is going to be the spitting image of her Romish mother. The image of the beast. The American Roman Catholic Church is going to appear to be aloof from the papacy and yet echo or mirror the European model of Catholicism. Appearances are deceiving, aren't they? You think the Roman Catholic Church in this country is officially patriotic? They are patriotic to their Pope. And they are the ones who occupy the most powerful seats in our government, while the rest of the American Roman Catholic pew sitters are ignorant and left that way. They are being enslaved and brought under the European model of Catholicism, just like the Protestants of this country. To Rome, they are no different than heretics. It's the leadership and the hierarchy of the American Roman Catholic Church who know what direction America is going. The rest of us are left ignorant. But you don't need to remain ignorant. Continue to listen to Inquisition Update Monday through Friday right here, 10 a.m. Central Time on FirstAmendmentRadio.com, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thanks for listening.